The church was quiet, but not silent. The smell of lilies hung in the air, mingling with the low hum of the organ. I had come to say goodbye to my wife, the woman who had stood beside me through decades of storms and sunlight. Yet before I could take my place at the front, her daughter-in-law stepped in, her voice sharp enough to cut the moment in two. She told me the front pew wasn't mine, that I should sit in the back, away from the woman I had built my life with. My heart froze. All I could think was, after a lifetime together, was I now to be treated like a guest at her funeral? Have you ever been pushed aside in your own family's most sacred moment, left wondering if dignity was something you had to fight for even in grief? I stood there, my shoes sinking slightly into the carpet of the church aisle, her words echoing like a slap. Sit in the back. It wasn't just a direction. It was a judgment, a sentence handed down without trial. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply felt the weight of it settle into me. But silence never means acceptance. Silence is often a pause, and I was already beginning to wonder what came next. I turned my eyes toward the casket at the front. White roses covered it, so many that from where I stood, I could barely see the polished wood beneath. My wife had loved roses. She grew them in a crooked row along the side of our house, fighting the soil every spring until something beautiful pushed through. And now, the daughter-in-law who told me to step aside was sitting close enough to those flowers to breathe them in, while I was meant to sit at the edge of the room watching from a distance. I hesitated in the aisle longer than I should have. People noticed. A cousin coughed politely. Someone whispered. My own son kept his eyes down, as if the whole exchange hadn't happened. That cut deeper than his wife's command. A man can forgive an outsider for cruelty, but his own blood looking away, that's a wound you can't stitch. When I finally walked toward the back, every step felt heavier. The pews creaked as I slid into the last row. From there, the front looked miles away, though in truth it was only a dozen steps. I tried to steady my hands by folding them together, pressing the knuckles until they went white. My wife would have told me to stand my ground, to take my place beside her one last time. But she wasn't here to guide me anymore. The service hadn't started yet. People moved quietly, taking seats, nodding at each other in hushed tones. I could feel eyes flicker toward me and then away again. Pity, curiosity, or just discomfort. Grief is heavy enough, but when family tension seeps into the cracks, it can turn mourning into something sharp and jagged. My mind drifted back to the morning. I had woken early, unable to sleep. The house felt emptier than it ever had. Her teacup still sat on the counter from yesterday, a thin rim of leaves at the bottom. I should have rinsed it, but I left it. Maybe because I wasn't ready to erase her from the small places she lived in. I had chosen my best suit, one she always said made me look dignified. As I tied the knot of my tie, my hands shook. Not because of the knot, it was because I knew today wasn't just about laying her to rest. It was about whether the life we built together would be honored or pushed aside. Sitting in the back pew, I thought about the first time I had seen her walk into a church. She was younger then, carrying her hymnal like it was a treasure. She caught my eye across the aisle, smiled just once, then went on singing. That was all it took. 50 years later, the memory still sat inside me, fresh as paint. And now, at her funeral, I was asked to be a bystander to the very love that had shaped my life. I clenched my jaw, not from anger but from something deeper, hurt mixed with disbelief. My son still hadn't looked back. His wife sat close to the front, smoothing her dress, adjusting her veil, acting as though she had earned the place beside my wife's memory. I wondered if she thought I was invisible. A shuffle of footsteps broke my thoughts. The pastor entered from the side door, his robe flowing, his face solemn. The room quieted. He stood at the lectern, cleared his throat, and looked directly at me, not at my son, not at his wife, not at the rows of family who had taken their places at the front. His eyes found mine in the back, steady and unyielding. "Sir," he said, his voice warm but firm, "this service cannot begin without you at the front. She would want you there." The silence that followed was louder than any murmur. I felt dozens of eyes turn. My daughter-in-law shifted uncomfortably, her posture stiffening. My son rubbed his temple, finally looking up at me, and for a moment, the world froze between their command and the pastor's invitation. I didn't move right away. My body stayed pressed into the pew, my knees resisting. Part of me feared that if I stood, someone else would stop me again, that I would be humiliated twice in the same morning. But another part, the part shaped by decades with my wife, told me dignity isn't something others hand you. It's something you stand up and claim. So I placed my palms on the wood, pushed myself up, and began walking down the aisle. Each step forward felt like reclaiming ground I had been forced to surrender. People leaned back slightly as I passed, making space. The roses grew clearer, the casket closer, my wife's presence stronger. When I reached the front row, I didn't look at my daughter-in-law. I didn't look at my son either. I sat down where I belonged, beside her memory, in the place of a husband who had walked the road with her from beginning to end. The pastor gave a small nod, as though confirming what he had known all along. Some seats cannot be reassigned. But even as I sat, a thought needled at me. Why had my son stayed silent? Why had the woman he married felt entitled to strip me of my place? Was this about grief, or was it about something deeper, something that had been building long before the funeral began? That question hung inside me like smoke, curling, refusing to settle. When I lowered myself into the front pew, I thought the room would settle, that the small battle had ended. But sitting there didn't feel like peace. It felt like the beginning of something unspoken breaking loose. My daughter-in-law's posture hardened beside the casket, her shoulders stiff, her chin lifted higher than before. She didn't say a word, but silence has its own language, and hers was loud. My son finally looked at me, though only for a heartbeat. His eyes slipped away quickly, as if contact carried a risk he wasn't ready to take. The pastor began the service, his voice steady and warm. He spoke of my wife's life, her kindness, her faith. People nodded along, but I couldn't shake the weight of what had already happened. While words of comfort filled the room, a storm was pressing just under the surface, waiting for its time. I could feel it in the way my daughter-in-law tapped her fingers against her lap, in the way my son avoided even the smallest glance toward me. The truth is, funerals don't just bury the dead, they dig up the living, their grievances, their loyalties, their secrets. And that morning, something old and unsettled was clawing its way into view. I remembered the years leading up to this day. My wife always tried to bridge the distance between me and my son's wife. She cooked for her, bought small gifts, invited her into conversations, but there was always a wall, not open hostility, just a quiet frost. I had thought, maybe foolishly, that grief would melt it, that standing together over loss would strip away the layers of pride. Instead, it seemed to sharpen the D. The pastor's words drifted over me, but my mind clung to details others wouldn't notice. My daughter-in-law shifting in her seat, her hands folded tighter each time the pastor mentioned my wife and me as a pair. My son scratching at his cufflink, looking like he wanted to vanish into his chair. It wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about place, about who belonged at the center of the story and who didn't. When the pastor paused, inviting family to share memories, I felt a surge of unease ripple through the room. My daughter-in-law stood quickly before anyone else moved. She walked to the lectern with polished steps, her dress whispering with each movement. Her voice rang clear as she began to speak about my wife, not as a mother-in-law, but as though she herself had been the closest soul to her. She spoke of the times they shared tea, of the recipes passed down, of the advice given. The words were kind, but every sentence carried an undertone. She was painting herself as the rightful heir to my wife's memory, as though I were already fading from it. I sat still, hands locked together, though my chest tightened with every phrase. She wasn't lying outright, but she was framing the story to center herself. And the longer she spoke, the more the audience leaned into her version. My son's eyes glistened, though whether from grief or agreement, I couldn't tell. When she finished, people clapped softly as if her speech had sealed the moment. She returned to her seat without looking at me, her expression calm, almost satisfied. The pastor looked to me then, his brow raised gently. "Would you like to speak?" I hesitated. My throat tightened. Half of me wanted to remain silent, to avoid stirring the pot further. But another part, the part that had walked beside my wife through every trial, who had held her hand through hospital stays, who had watched her labor over every holiday meal for the family, knew I couldn't let the story be rewritten. I rose, slowly. The room shifted, some faces expectant, some wary. My daughter-in-law's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. I walked to the lectern, each step heavy with memory. My hand rested on its edge as I looked out. The crowd blurred, but I saw my son clearly, his shoulders tight, his jaw clenched. I began not with grand declarations, but with the simple truth. I spoke of the first time I met my wife, of how she had taught me patience, how she laughed when storms ruined her garden but replanted anyway. I spoke of her sacrifices, how she worked nights so the children could go to school, how she mended clothes until her fingers hurt, how she always put family before herself. And then I let silence hang, before saying the one thing that cut through every layer of conflict. She chose me, and for 50 years, she chose me every day. I won't let anyone forget that. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried the quiet weight of a life lived side by side. When I returned to my seat, the air felt heavier. My daughter-in-law didn't look at me, but I saw the flush rise in her cheeks. My son's lips pressed together, a line that betrayed both discomfort and something deeper. The pastor moved on quickly, easing the tension, but it was clear. A battle had been drawn in invisible ink, visible only to those at its center. The rest of the service carried on, hymns sung, verses read. Yet under it all the question lingered in my chest. Why had my son stayed silent when his wife told me to step aside? That silence was louder than any insult. And as the final prayer was spoken, I realized the funeral wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of a reckoning, one that would stretch beyond this church into the very fabric of our family. As the service ended, people rose slowly, shuffling toward the doors in murmurs and handshakes. Some leaned close to me, whispering kind words about my wife, about the strength of our years together. I nodded, thanked them, held on to their words like stones in my pocket. But beneath it all, I was still carrying the sting of that earlier moment, the command to sit in the back, and my son's silence that allowed it. Walking out of the church, I could feel the tension thick as smoke. My daughter-in-law stood tall, accepting condolences like a hostess at her own gathering. My son hovered just behind her, letting her lead, his eyes darting everywhere but toward me. That avoidance gnawed at me. It wasn't just grief. It was a choice, a decision to stay quiet when I needed him to stand. The crowd thinned, and the air outside was heavy with late morning heat. I stopped near the steps, watching the hearse pull slowly into place. The polished car reflected the sky, and for a moment I thought about how many times my wife had told me not to worry about appearances. She always said dignity came from action, not from shine. Yet here we were, every movement rehearsed to look proper, while the truth was left to rot unspoken. I stayed back as family clustered around the car. My daughter-in-law kept her hand firmly on my son's arm, guiding him toward the front again. It struck me then, she wasn't just filling a space left by my wife. She was trying to claim authority, to rewrite who belonged where. The pastor found me at the edge of the crowd. His hand rested gently on my shoulder. "You spoke from the heart," he said quietly. "Sometimes that's harder than people realize." I nodded, but words felt thin. I wanted to believe my wife's memory was safe, but I could see it already being reshaped, carved into a version that centered everyone but me. The graveside service was shorter, though just as heavy. I stood near the casket, closer than before, determined not to be pushed aside again. The pastor said his final words, and the flowers lowered with the box that carried the rest of my life. My son stood rigid, his wife dabbing at her eyes, though her glances in my direction held no warmth. When it ended, people drifted away, some lingering, some leaving quickly. I stayed rooted, staring at the patch of earth that would soon cover her. Memories pressed in hard, her laughter in the kitchen, the way she leaned against me when her feet hurt, the sound of her voice calling me in from the yard. And yet, layered over those memories was another sound, the silence of my son when I needed him most. That silence was heavier than the soil waiting to fall. As people began walking toward their cars, I caught him finally looking at me. For a moment, our eyes locked. I searched for something. Apology, grief shared, even anger I could understand. But what I saw was distance. A wall. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, following his wife back to their car. That was when I knew. This wasn't just about today. This was the surface of something that had been building for years. My wife had patched over cracks, kept peace where she could, but now that she was gone, the fractures were showing. On the drive home, the car felt empty. I kept glancing at the seat beside me, half expecting to see her there, scolding me for not eating, humming along to the radio. Instead, the silence pressed in. I gripped the wheel tighter, not from anger but from the weight of being left with questions no one would answer. I thought about the times my son had pulled away slowly over the years, the missed visits, the excuses about work, the quick phone calls instead of long talks. My wife always said, "He'll come around. Just give him time." She believed in patience, in love winning out eventually, but I wondered now if patience had only given distance room to grow. When I pulled into the driveway, the roses by the side of the house caught my eye. They were still in bloom, though a few petals had fallen, scattering across the soil. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at them, remembering how she used to bend low with her clippers, talking to the plants as though they could hear her. I thought about how she once said roses bloom better when you cut away what's dying. That thought lingered, unsettling. Because what if the same was true of families? What if holding on to what was broken only choked the life out of what could still survive? That night, the house groaned with emptiness. I heated soup but couldn't finish it. The chair across the table sat unfilled, her presence felt in its absence. I walked through the rooms, each corner carrying echoes of her perfume faint on the dresser, her knitting tucked into a basket, her slippers by the bed. But the quiet wasn't just grief, it was warning. A sense that today had opened a door I couldn't close. My daughter-in-law had drawn a line, and my son had chosen not to erase it. The question was no longer whether they respected me. It was whether I would allow them to decide where I belonged. And somewhere deep inside, through the grief and fatigue, a thought began to take root. Perhaps this funeral was not only an ending. Perhaps it was also the start of something I hadn't expected. A reckoning, not just with loss, but with the truth about the family I still had left. The day after the funeral, the house felt like a museum. Every chair, every photograph, every folded blanket held a memory I couldn't escape. I woke early, though I hadn't slept much, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold before I even touched it. I thought about the graveside, about the silence from my son, about the look in his wife's eyes as though she had already decided where I belonged. The funeral had been final in one sense, but it also left something unfinished, like a conversation cut off mid-sentence. That unsettled feeling grew heavier as the hours passed. I realized I couldn't leave it hanging. If I did, resentment would root itself deeper, and soon it wouldn't just be silence between us. It would be a wall imposed, Sybil to cross. My wife would not have wanted that. She believed in addressing trouble before it turned into something harder. With that in mind, I decided I needed to see him. Not in public, not with her standing between us, but face to face where he couldn't look away. By late afternoon, I drove across town to his house. The neighborhood was neat, manicured lawns and trimmed hedges, the sort of place where people cared about appearances. I parked at the curb, staring at the front door longer than I should have. Part of me wanted to turn around, to let it be, but I thought of my wife's voice again, reminding me that silence can destroy more than words ever will. When he opened the door, he looked surprised, though not completely, as though he had expected me eventually, but not so soon. He stepped aside, letting me in, and I noticed his wife wasn't there. That gave me a small sense of relief. Inside, the air smelled faintly of candles, maybe an attempt to cover up the emptiness left after the service. He motioned toward the living room, and we sat opposite each other, the space between us carrying more weight than anything spoken yet. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure either," I answered. "But there are things I can't let pass." His eyes flickered, and I could see the boy he once was, the one who used to come running when he scraped his knee, the one who wanted me to watch him play ball, the one who trusted me. But that boy was buried under years of distance, and I knew pulling him back wouldn't be simple. At first, neither of us spoke again. The silence stretched, filled with things unsaid. Finally, I leaned forward. "Yesterday, when I was told to sit in the back, you didn't say anything, not a word. You let it happen." He rubbed his hands together, avoiding my gaze. "It was her decision. I didn't want to make a scene at the funeral." "And where did that leave me?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "It was my wife they were burying, the woman I spent more than half my life with, and I was treated like a guest in my own grief." His jaw tightened. "I know how it looked, but I thought keeping peace was better than starting a fight in front of everyone." I shook my head slowly. Peace at the cost of respect isn't peace at all. It's surrender, and yesterday you surrendered me. The words hung in the air. He leaned back, finally meeting my eyes. There was shame there, but also something else. Resentment. "You don't understand," he said. "It's not just about yesterday. She feels like you've always had the final say. About money, about family decisions, about everything. She wanted to make sure I stood on my own, not under your shadow." I felt the sting of that. My shadow. I worked my whole life to keep this family steady. If that cast a shadow, it wasn't meant to smother, it was meant to shield. And you of all people should know that. He looked down in, his voice lower. "I do know, but it doesn't change how she feels. And if I push back against her, I risk losing the marriage I'm trying to hold together." For a long moment I just stared at him. I could see his struggle, torn between loyalty to his wife and loyalty to his father. I could even understand the pull of it. But what hurt most was realizing that in his calculation, I was the one he could afford to let go. "Do you think she'll stop at yesterday?" I asked quietly. "Do you think that was the end? Or was it the beginning of rewriting where I stand in this family?" He didn't answer, and that silence told me more than any words could. I leaned back, the weight of years pressing down. "Your mother used to tell me you'd come around. That patience would heal the gaps. But yesterday showed me patience isn't enough anymore. If I keep waiting, there may not be anything left between us worth saving." His face softened, and for the first time that day, I saw a crack in his armor. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice almost breaking. "Then don't let her make that choice for you," I replied. The room grew still, both of us caught in the balance of what would come next. I didn't press further. I had said what needed saying, and now it was on him to decide. When I stood to leave, he walked me to the door. Neither of us reached for a hug, though I wanted to. I settled for resting a hand briefly on his shoulder before stepping out. On the drive home, I felt no clear resolution, but I did feel something I hadn't since the funeral, a sense that the silence had been broken. The distance wasn't erased, but at least it was named. Sometimes naming a wound is the first step toward healing it. Still, I knew this wasn't the end of the struggle. My daughter-in-law's influence wasn't going away. My son's choice would not be easy, and I would have to decide what kind of place I wanted in a family that no longer treated me as its anchor. As the sun sank low, painting the horizon in dim light, I thought again of my wife. She would have wanted me to fight, not with anger, but with truth, to remind our son of who he was, and of the bond we once shared. Whether he reached for it again was something I couldn't control. What I could control was how I carried myself. I would not shrink into the background of my own family. I would not allow silence to bury me before my time. The funeral had closed one chapter. Now came the harder part, living in the shadow of what was lost, while still standing tall enough to claim what remained. The days following my visit to my son's house felt like walking through fog. I replayed our conversation again and again, searching for signs that he might step forward, that he might find the courage to stand with me rather than behind her. But the silence that followed told its own story. He wasn't ready, or maybe he wasn't willing. Either way, it left me with the same gnawing question. If I stayed quiet now, what else would be taken from me piece by piece? It was during this restless stretch that a call came from my brother. He had flown in for the funeral but hadn't had much time to sit with me afterward. "Come over," he said. "Aid. I think you need some company." I agreed, not realizing at the time how much that meeting would shift the ground beneath me. His house was smaller, humbler than mine, but it had a warmth I hadn't felt in weeks. He poured me tea, and we sat at the kitchen table, a place where serious words always seemed to find their way out. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "You've been carrying yourself like a man who's lost more than a wife," he said. I didn't argue, because I have. I've lost my place in my own family. He nodded slowly, as if weighing each word. "And do you intend to let them decide that for you? Or do you intend to claim what's still yours?" That question hit harder than I expected. I realized I'd been waiting for something to change on its own, waiting for my son to come back to me. But my brother was right. Waiting was only letting the balance shift further away. That night when I went home, I opened the desk drawer where my wife used to keep important papers, insurance documents, property deeds, the kind of things we always said we'd sort through later. She had once told me, almost offhand, that she wanted me to make sure things were protected, that our years of work weren't left to chance or manipulation. I had brushed it off then, not realizing how prophetic her concern would be. I called my lawyer the next morning. Sitting across from him in his office, surrounded by shelves of books that smelled faintly of leather and dust, I laid it all out. Not just the funeral incident, but the larger pattern, the way my daughter-in-law treated me, the silence of my son, the risk of being erased from decisions that should have been shared. He listened carefully, not interrupting, then leaned back. "You're not powerless," he said. "Your wife's estate, your assets, the family properties, they can be structured so that your role cannot be ignored. You can make it clear in writing that your dignity is not up for negotiation." I sat with that thought. It felt less like vengeance and more like necessity. I wasn't trying to punish my son. I was trying to make sure that the respect I had earned across decades wasn't tossed aside the way they had tried to do at the funeral. So we began the work. It was tedious at times, but with each signature, with each document drafted, I felt a shift. It was as though I was reclaiming ground I hadn't realized I'd been letting slip away. I wasn't loud about it. I didn't announce it to my son, but in quiet, deliberate steps, I was making sure my voice could not be silenced, even if they tried. A week later, the family gathered at my house. It wasn't planned as anything dramatic, just a dinner that my daughter had suggested so we wouldn't drift further apart. I almost canceled, fearing another scene, but something in me said this was the right time. The table was set simply, food laid out in the familiar dishes my wife used to use. For a while, the air was stiff, conversation limited to pleasantries. My daughter-in-law smiled politely, but avoided direct eye contact. My son looked worn, like a man torn between two roads. Halfway through the meal, I set my fork down. The clinking of metal on porcelain caught everyone's attention. I looked around the table, letting the silence linger just long enough. "I want to say something," I began. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled slightly under the table. At the funeral, I was treated as though my place beside my wife was negotiable. That cannot happen again. Not at another family gathering, not in any part of my life. I won't be pushed aside in the family I helped build. The room went still. My son's eyes flickered to his wife, then back to me. She shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. I continued. I've already taken steps to make sure my role cannot be rewritten. The properties, the accounts, the family business, all of it now reflects the truth. My voice will be heard, whether in this room or on paper. If anyone here thinks they can decide otherwise, they are mistaken. It wasn't anger that drove my words, but clarity. For the first time since the funeral, I felt the ground beneath me firm. My daughter nodded slowly, her eyes soft with understanding. My son swallowed hard, caught between loyalty and fear. His wife finally spoke, her tone measured but defensive. No one was trying to erase you. Emotions were high. We just wanted things done differently. I met her gaze evenly. Differently is one thing. Disrespect is another, and I know the difference. The silence stretched again, heavier this time. Then my son spoke. Dad, I should have stood up for you that day. I see that now. I won't let it happen again. His words didn't erase the hurt, but they planted something fragile, a chance. Whether it would grow depended on what he chose tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. But for me, the shift had already taken place. I was no longer waiting for dignity to be handed back. I had claimed it, both in word and in action. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone at the table, the dishes still scattered, the echoes of conversation fading. I thought of my wife, of how she would have smiled at me for finding strength in the face of humiliation, and I realized something important. Grief may strip you bare, but it can also force you to stand taller than you thought possible. I didn't know what the future held for my relationship with my son or his wife, but I did know this. I was not invisible, and I never would be. The night after the family dinner, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my son's face across the table, his hesitation, his guilt, his brief moment of resolve when he finally admitted what I had long needed to hear. I should have stood up for you. Those words replayed in my mind, not because they fixed everything, but because they cracked open the possibility of something better. Yet I knew words without action could fade into nothing. By morning, I found myself walking through the garden, the same place my wife used to tend with such patience. Her roses were still alive, though some needed trimming. I stood there, shears in hand, thinking about how much of life is about maintenance, cutting back, nurturing, making sure growth continues in the right direction. Families are no different. If you ignore what needs tending, the weeds take over. It was in that quiet that I decided I wouldn't wait for reconciliation to stumble toward me. I would set the course myself. My wife would have expected that of me, strength not born of anger, but of clarity. So when Sunday came, I did something unexpected. I went back to the same church where her funeral was held. The pews were empty, the air lighter without grief pressing down on it. I asked the pastor if I could sit with him for a while. He nodded, leading me to his office. I told him what happened, the humiliation of being told to sit in the back, the silence of my son, the way my dignity had been placed on trial in front of everyone. He listened, his hands folded, his eyes steady. Finally, he spoke. A man who has lived a full life should never be told to shrink himself. You sat beside your wife in life. You had every right to sit beside her in death. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. His words steadied something inside me. I had already taken practical steps with my lawyer, but this was different. This was about the spirit of the thing. It wasn't only about property or papers. It was about standing where I belonged and not apologizing for it. When I returned home, my daughter called. She wanted to check on me after the dinner. Her voice was careful but warm. "Dad, I saw how strong you were the other night," she said. "It reminded me of Mom. She never let anyone decide her worth either." I smiled at that, My daughter had inherited her mother's sharpness, her quiet but unshakable strength. We talked for an hour, about small things and big ones, but underneath it all, I felt a shift. Not everyone in the family saw me as expendable. That truth mattered more than I realized. Days passed, and life settled into its rhythm again. Yet one evening my son came to visit me alone. His wife stayed home. He sat across from me at the same table where we had shared so many meals. He looked older than his years, worn down by the tug-of-war between loyalty to his wife and respect for me. "Dad," he began, "I need to apologize properly. I froze at the funeral. I let you down. I see that now, and I don't want to keep failing you." I studied him carefully. His words carried weight, but I had to know if they would hold. "Do you understand why it mattered so much?" I asked. He nodded. "Because it wasn't just about a seat in church. It was about what it meant. You were her husband. You built this family. You had the right to stand at the front, and I should have defended that." Hearing him say it aloud lifted a weight I had been carrying since that day. He didn't excuse it. He named it for what it was. That, to me, was the beginning of something real. We talked long into the night. Not everything was resolved, and I didn't expect it to be. But for the first time, I felt my son and I standing on the same ground again. He was reaching for me, even if it was late. As he left, he turned back at the door. "Dad, I promise. I'll make sure. No one disrespects you again. Not while I'm there." It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And for me, progress was enough. Later that night, I sat once more in the quiet of my house. I thought of my wife, of the years we shared, of the way she would have laughed at the idea of me being told to sit in the back of a church. She would have said, "You? Sit in the back? Not in this lifetime." And I realized then that her voice still lived in me. Every decision I made to protect my place, every moment I chose to speak instead of staying silent, it was her strength moving through me. The funeral had been an attempt to reduce me, but in the weeks that followed, I found myself standing taller. Not because I won an argument, but because I remembered who I was. A husband, a father, a man who had earned his place at the front, not through demand, but through a lifetime of showing up. So when I think back on that day now, I don't only see the humiliation, I see the moment it forced me to stop waiting for respect and start claiming it again. In that sense, my wife gave me one final gift. Through her absence, she reminded me of my own strength, and I will carry that with me until the end. The courthouse felt colder the second time around, though I couldn't tell if it was the air conditioning or just the way silence tightened around me when I stepped inside. I kept my coat buttoned even though it wasn't necessary. It gave me something to hold on to, a small shield against eyes that weren't exactly kind. Family disputes have a way of turning ordinary rooms into stages where everyone waits for the next scene, the next reveal, the next wound to surface. Reflective transition. I remember thinking back to the first envelope, how the room went quiet when I handed it over. That moment hadn't ended the conflict. It had simply exposed the cracks that had been there all along. What unsettled me most wasn't that my children were angry. It was how quickly they had begun treating me like a stranger standing in their way. The clerk announced the case. My name echoed in the chamber, and I walked forward. My son sat with his arms crossed, tapping his foot on the polished floor. My daughter avoided looking at me altogether. For years, I had imagined that age would soften family arguments, that disagreements would shrink in importance as the years added up. Instead, time had sharpened theirs into demands. The lawyer leaned in before the judge entered, his whisper calm but firm. He reminded me not to get pulled into speeches or emotional appeals. "Facts are your safety," he said. I nodded, though part of me still wanted to stand and ask why. Why did it come to this? Why couldn't we talk? Why did papers and signatures carry more weight than dinners we once shared together? The judge entered, papers shuffled, and statements began. My son's lawyer painted me as stubborn, unwilling to share what should have been evenly divided. He used words like unfair, controlling, secretive. My daughter's silence wasn't neutrality, it was agreement without his effort. Every sentence they built was meant to box me in. Suspenseful transition. Sitting there, I realized the real battle wasn't over the property itself, but over perception. If they could frame me as unreasonable, they'd win more than just the house. They'd win the story of who I was in this family, and that frightened me more than losing land. When it was my lawyer's turn, he kept his focus sharp. He laid out timelines, contracts, transfers. He explained that I hadn't hidden anything, that decisions had been prepared, documented, and even discussed. He reminded the court that what I signed wasn't an act of defiance, but preparation, a safeguard. The room grew still again, just as it had during that first envelope. I glanced at my son. His tapping foot had stopped, but his jaw worked as if chewing over words he couldn't spit out. My daughter finally looked at me, though her expression was unreadable. That moment of eye contact reminded me of when she was young, tugging on my sleeve to ask for help with homework, her eyes clear and trusting. Now they carried distance, as though I had shifted into a role she couldn't recognize. Conversational transition. It struck me then that these hearings weren't just about what I'd done. They were about whether my children believed I still had the right to choose for myself. They saw the house as inheritance, but I saw it as memory, sweat, sacrifice. Could I explain that in words the court would accept? Probably not. But I could carry it in how I stood there, unshaken, while they tried to turn me into a villain. The judge leaned forward, fingers interlocked. "This is not about punishment," he said, his voice steady. "This is about clarity." He asked each side if they understood the documents in question and whether they accepted that my actions had been legal. My son shifted in his chair. My daughter's lawyer whispered something, but she didn't respond. When the judge confirmed that my choice was valid, I felt the tension lift just slightly, like a window cracked open in a stale room. It wasn't victory in the way people cheer for wins, but it was enough to remind me I hadn't lost myself. Reflective transition. Walking out, I thought about how different endings feel when they aren't tied to celebration but to survival. My children hadn't stormed after me this time, but the silence between us was heavy. A parent always imagines reconciliation, yet I had to accept that their anger might not fade soon. I paused at the top of the courthouse steps, watching strangers move around me, carrying folders, making calls, rushing toward their own battles. I didn't envy them, but I recognized something in their urgency, how much effort it takes just to hold your ground. For me, it was never about winning against my children. It was about reminding them, even if they refused to hear it, that my choices were still my own. A lifetime of work had gone into building that house, and if they saw it only as inheritance, then perhaps they weren't ready to understand what it meant to me. Suspenseful transition. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't over. Family grudges don't dissolve because a gavel hits wood. They linger, reshaping themselves into the next dispute, the next demand. As I headed home, I wondered how long it would take before another envelope had to be prepared. The car ride was quiet. My lawyer didn't fill the silence, and I didn't either. I looked out the window, memorizing the passing streets, the small shops, the fading afternoon light. These were the pieces of life my children seemed to overlook in their hunger for property, the everyday places where real legacy lived. When I reached the house, I placed my keys on the table and sat in the chair by the window. The house no longer felt entirely mine, not because of paperwork, but because conflict had crept into its walls. Yet it was still the only place where my memories lived intact. And I decided then, no matter how many times I had to walk into that courthouse, I would not sign away the right to choose what happens to what I built. Not out of spite, but out of the same stubbornness that kept me working through years when giving up would have been easier. The days after court felt slower, though the quiet carried its own weight. I thought once the judge confirmed my decision, the matter would rest. But silence doesn't always mean peace. It can be the pause before the next strike. I knew my children well enough to understand that defeat rarely ended with acceptance. Reflective transition. I couldn't stop replaying their faces in that courtroom. My son's jaw locked tight, my daughter's unwilling glance. It wasn't just anger, it was disbelief, as though I had betrayed some unspoken script they had written for me. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that they weren't done testing me. It began with phone calls I didn't answer. Then letters slipped under the door, not from lawyers this time, but written in my children's own hands. My son's note was short, clipped, almost an order. "You're pushing us out. You're making a mistake." My daughter's letter was longer, circling back to memories of childhood, asking if I really wanted things to end this way. Both of them avoided saying what they really meant. They wanted control. Suspenseful transition. I kept those letters on the kitchen table for days, unopened after the first reading, watching the paper curl at the edges. I didn't reply, because deep down, I suspected that if I gave them even a word, they'd take it as permission to reopen the fight. But silence has its price, and I soon discovered they were planning another way forward. The first sign was a knock on the door one evening. It wasn't my children, but a cousin I hadn't seen in years. He shuffled his feet on the porch holding an envelope. "They came to me," he admitted, eyes avoiding mine. "They said you weren't thinking clearly anymore, that maybe the family should intervene." I let him inside, poured tea, and listened. My children were spreading the idea that I couldn't manage my own affairs, that age had clouded my judgment. It was a sharp move, one I hadn't expected, but one that stung worse than any courtroom argument. To say I was weak wasn't just strategy, it was stripping me of dignity. Conversational transition. I laughed, though it wasn't from humor. It was the kind of laugh that escapes when you realize the people you raised are now building stories against you. I asked my cousin what he thought. He shrugged, said he didn't know, but the seed of doubt had already been planted in him. That was the danger. Once suspicion starts, it spreads. That night I sat at my desk, opened the drawer where I kept my will, and reread every line. The house, the rentals, the savings, they were all accounted for. I had already set up protections, but something inside me shifted. I realized that if I simply defended myself each time they attacked, I'd always be one step behind. I needed to take the lead. Reflective transition. That thought unsettled me because parents don't imagine outmaneuvering their own children. You want to guide them, not strategize against them. But if they had turned me into their opponent, then I had no choice but to prepare as if the next battle was already on its way. I called my lawyer the next morning. He listened carefully as I explained what was happening. His tone didn't change, but I could sense his concern. "If they're questioning your capacity, we'll need to establish clarity before they push harder," he said. He recommended a medical evaluation, something formal, documented, irrefutable, not because I needed it, but because others would. I agreed. The tests weren't difficult, though sitting across from a doctor being asked to recall numbers, words, and small details carried a quiet humiliation. Still, I answered each question without hesitation. The doctor smiled at the end, said my mind was sharper than many 10 years younger. I took the report home, slid it into the same folder as my legal documents. Suspenseful transition. I thought having that proof would give me relief. Instead, it felt like loading a weapon. It wasn't protection until it was used, and part of me dreaded the day it would need to be. And as expected, that day didn't take long to arrive. My son appeared at the house without warning. He didn't knock this time, he used the spare key I'd forgotten he had. I found him in the living room pacing, looking at the framed photographs as though deciding which ones still belonged to him. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice carrying frustration, maybe even desperation. "You can't keep shutting us out. You should be preparing to hand things over, not hiding behind papers." I stood across from him, calm on the surface, though my chest tightened. "I'm not hiding. I'm choosing. And that's still my right." His eyes narrowed. "For now." Conversational transition. That phrase stayed with me long after he left. 2 words, heavy with threat. for now. It wasn't a son speaking to his father. It was an adversary waiting for an opening, and it told me he wouldn't stop until he found one. Later that week, I called a notary and signed a new document. It didn't change the distribution of the estate, but placed everything into a trust managed by a third party, beyond the reach of sudden challenges. My lawyer explained it would add another layer, one harder for anyone to undo without years of effort. It wasn't what I had planned originally, but plans change when trust is broken. Reflective transition. As I sealed the papers in their envelope, I felt both relief and sadness. Relief because I had secured what mattered. Sadness because I never thought I'd have to protect my life's work from the very people it was meant for. That's the cruel trick of betrayal. It forces you to act in ways you once believed were unnecessary. When my daughter finally came by, she didn't argue. She sat quietly at the table, stirring her tea without drinking it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Do you really want us to remember you this way?" I looked at her, remembering the letter she'd written, the eyes that once searched mine for answers to smaller problems. "I want you to remember me as someone who didn't give up what he built, not even when it was difficult." She didn't respond. She just set her cup down and left without finishing the tea. Suspenseful transition. Watching her walk away, I realized something. The fight wasn't only about property anymore. It was about how I would be remembered. Would they see me as stubborn or as steady, as selfish or as protective? I couldn't control their version entirely, but I could control my actions while I was still here, and that would have to be enough. That night, I locked the front door, double-checking it even though I knew it was secure. I turned off the lights, sat in the dark, and thought about the strange truth. A man can spend a lifetime raising a family and still find himself preparing for battles against them. But if survival demands it, then that's what must be done. I had thought the trust would be the final step, the line that could not be crossed. But families don't always respect lines. They look for cracks, and when they find one, they pry until the whole wall trembles. That truth arrived in the form of a letter delivered by hand, stamped not from my children, but from their attorney. Reflective transition. The moment I saw the envelope, my stomach turned in a way I hadn't felt since the funeral. It wasn't just paper. It was a signal that the fight had shifted gears, becoming colder, more calculated. I had braced myself for anger, for tears, for pleading. What I hadn't braced for was the efficiency of a legal threat. The letter claimed my children intended to challenge the trust, alleging undue influence and questionable judgment. Words designed to sting, words chosen to paint me as fragile, incapable, a man who no longer knew what he was doing. I sat at the table and read it twice, then a third time, making sure I wasn't misinterpreting. But no, the meaning was clear. They were prepared to strip me of authority through the courts. Suspenseful transition. I didn't call my lawyer immediately. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and sat in silence, listening to the tick of the clock in the kitchen. There's a kind of silence that arrives before a storm, not calm but charged, like the air is waiting for lightning. That's what the room felt like, and I realized the storm was already overhead. The next morning, I went into town. Not for groceries, not for errands. I walked into my lawyer's office, letter in hand. He read it, then leaned back in his chair with a sigh. "They're playing the long game now," he said. "They're betting the process will wear you down." I shook my head. They still don't understand. I won't be worn down, not by them. Conversational transition. I think he believed me, but I also think he worried. Worry shows in the way a man pauses before speaking, the way his pen lingers over paper. He suggested something I hadn't expected: mediation. "Sometimes," he said, "a room with a neutral party can settle what the courts only drag out." Mediation sounded like compromise. I didn't like the taste of it, but I agreed, not because I thought it would solve things, but because I wanted to see my children face to face, not through papers, not through lawyers, face to face, with no hiding. The day came, and we sat around a polished table. My son leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes hard. My daughter stared down at her hands, twisting the ring on her finger. The mediator, a man who looked too calm for the room he was in, opened with pleasantries. But pleasantries don't change truth. "I want to know why," I said, cutting through his words. "Why this fight? Why now?" My son answered before the mediator could redirect. "Because you're making choices you shouldn't be making alone." I met his gaze. Alone? I made a life with your mother. I made a family. I built these walls with my hands. And you call that alone? His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. My daughter's voice was softer when it came. "We just don't want to be left out." Suspenseful transition. Left out. That phrase stayed with me longer than I expected, because it wasn't just about property. It was about belonging. But belonging doesn't come through inheritance papers. It comes through respect, through trust. And in that moment I realized my children weren't asking to belong. They were demanding to control. And that difference made all the difference. The mediator tried to steer us back, suggesting compromises, percentages, arrangements. I listened, nodded politely, but inside I had already decided. I would not give in, not 1 inch more. My silence wasn't stubbornness, it was survival. By the end of the session, nothing was resolved. My son left with a glare, my daughter with a sigh. The mediator scribbled notes, muttering something about ongoing dialogue. But as I walked out, I knew dialogue wasn't what they wanted. They wanted victory. Reflective transition. That night I went through old photographs, the ones of birthdays, graduations, family trips. I studied their faces, my children younger, smiling, reaching for my hand. I asked myself when the shift happened, when love turned into this battlefield. Maybe it was gradual, maybe it was always there beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to break through. The following week, another letter arrived. Court papers this time, official, demanding a hearing. My lawyer called me in, explained the strategy, reassured me that the trust was strong, the evaluations unshakable. "But," he said, "this will be drawn out. They'll try to paint a story, and you'll have to stand firm." I nodded. Standing firm is all I have left. Conversational transition. Some might think I was bitter, clinging to documents and signatures. But that wasn't it. It was about dignity, about not letting the people you love decide that your worth ends when you stop giving them what they want. I couldn't accept that version of myself. The day of the hearing arrived. I walked into the courtroom, steady, papers in hand. My children sat across from me, their attorney whispering in their ears. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. My lawyer began, laying out the evidence, the evaluations, the documents. Then it was their turn. Their attorney stood, voice sharp, words rehearsed. He painted me as vulnerable, confused, influenced by outsiders. My son nodded at every sentence. My daughter kept her eyes lowered. I sat still, listening, not reacting, because sometimes silence is louder than any protest. Suspenseful transition. When the judge turned to me, asking if I wanted to speak, I rose slowly. The courtroom seemed smaller then, as if the walls had pulled in. My voice didn't shake. "I may be older," I said, "but I am not lost. Every choice I've made was mine. And if protecting my life's work means standing here against my own blood, then so be it. Because no one, not even family, has the right to take a man's dignity while he is still alive." The judge listened. The room was quiet, except for the scratch of his pen across paper. My children shifted uncomfortably, their confidence less certain now, and I realized, in that moment, that I wasn't just defending property. I was defending the very right to still be seen as myself. When the judge recessed for deliberation, the room emptied slowly, as if no one wanted to be the first to leave. My lawyer packed his files neatly, his calm face betraying only the smallest flicker of unease. My son and daughter avoided my eyes, whispering to their attorney instead. I stayed seated, hands on the table, feeling the weight of the air around me. It wasn't just a legal matter anymore. It was a verdict on my role as a father, a husband, and a man. Reflective transition. In those quiet minutes, I thought about how easily dignity can be questioned. Not stolen, not destroyed, just questioned, as though it were a privilege instead of a right. And I realized this case wasn't about property or inheritance at all. It was about whether I still had the right to steer my own life without permission. When the judge returned, the room snapped back to order. He adjusted his glasses, shuffled his notes, and began speaking. His words carried the steady rhythm of authority, measured but final. He acknowledged the evidence of my evaluations, the credibility of my lawyer's testimony, and the strength of the trust. He also acknowledged the concern my children expressed, their claim that they were acting out of care rather than greed. Suspenseful transition, my breath caught because I didn't know which way he would lean. Judges are human. They see more than papers. They read faces, tones, and histories. And ours was a family torn apart in full view of the court. Finally, he ruled. The trust stood. My capacity to decide for myself was upheld. My children's challenge was denied. The words fell heavy, like stones hitting the ground. My lawyer gave a small nod. My son cursed under his breath. My daughter closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down, but I couldn't tell whether it was grief or frustration. Conversational transition. You might think I felt triumphant, that I walked out proud, chin high, certain I had won. But that's not what victory feels like when it comes at the cost of family. It felt like standing on a hill alone, the view wide, but the silence endless. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered, curious about a case that had become more than paperwork. I ignored them, walking past without a word. My children followed behind at a distance, their steps heavy. For a moment, I thought they might speak to me, but instead, they turned toward their car and drove off. At home, I sat in the chair where my wife used to read in the evenings. Her absence filled the room more than any words could. I wanted to tell her what had happened, to hear her say I had done right, that protecting the life we built was worth the cost. Instead, I sat in silence, replaying the judge's words, my children's faces, the lawyer's steady voice. Reflective transition. Winning in court doesn't mend what's broken at the table. That night, I ate dinner alone. The phone never rang. No apology, no attempt at peace. And I wondered whether the verdict had truly settled anything, or whether it had simply carved the rift deeper. Days passed and letters stopped coming. The legal fight was over, at least on paper, but paper doesn't hold people together. One evening, I saw my daughter in town. She spotted me too, but instead of walking away, she approached. Her voice was low, careful. "Dad, I didn't want it to go this far." I searched her eyes, trying to find the little girl who once clung to my hand on her first day of school. "Then why let it?" I asked. She swallowed hard. "Because I was afraid we'd be left with nothing." Suspenseful transition. Her words carried more weight than the court documents ever could. They weren't just about money. They were about fear, the fear of being forgotten, of being unimportant. And fear, when it grows unchecked, can twist love into suspicion. I didn't answer right away. We stood in silence outside the bakery, people passing by, the world moving around us as if our family's fracture was invisible. Finally, I said, "What you inherit isn't property. It's the way you carry our name. And right now you're carrying it like it's a burden instead of a gift." She didn't argue. She just nodded, eyes glistening, and walked away. That night, I realized something important. Courtrooms can deliver rulings, but they can't deliver reconciliation. That work had to come from us, if we were willing, and I wasn't sure we were. Conversational transition. Some nights, I still imagine what it would have been like if my children had chosen differently, if they had sat beside me at the front pew during the funeral instead of pushing me back, if they had trusted me enough to believe my choices honored their mother's memory, not erased it. Those ifs are heavy, but life doesn't give second drafts. It only gives pages already written. The courthouse ruling should have been the end of it, but endings are rarely as clean as they look on paper. The judgment only drew a line in the legal sense. It didn't draw one in the heart. My children knew the law wasn't on their side anymore, but bitterness doesn't obey orders. It lingers, it festers, and sometimes it finds another way out. Reflective transition. I could feel it in the silence that followed. Court documents may close a case, but they don't close wounds. That silence from my son and daughter wasn't peace. It was distance, and distance, in families, is often louder than arguments. A week later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Not a legal one, not stamped with court markings, but a handwritten note in my son's slanted script. The message was short, clipped, as though every word cost him effort. He wanted to meet. He didn't say why, only that it mattered. Suspenseful transition. Part of me hesitated. I had seen what his intentions looked like when filtered through lawyers and courtrooms, but a father doesn't stop being a father just because a judge affirms his independence. So I went. We met at a cafe off the highway, the kind of place where no one lingers too long. He was already seated, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the tabletop. He didn't stand when I approached. "I still don't agree with what you did," he said, without greeting. "I didn't ask for agreement," I answered. "I asked for respect." He leaned forward. "Respect works both ways. You didn't respect us when you locked everything into that trust. You decided without even asking." Conversational transition. His words weren't new. I had heard them echoed in the courtroom, whispered behind closed doors. But hearing them face to face, without attorneys between us, was different. It was raw, and for a moment I almost saw the boy he once was, the one who believed every decision I made was unshakable truth. I told him the truth as I saw it, that the trust wasn't built out of spite but out of caution, that I wanted the security of knowing what your mother and I built wouldn't be shredded apart if grief ever turned into greed. "Greed," he repeated, his voice rising. "You think that's what this was?" "I think fear pushed you there," I said, "and fear dressed itself up like responsibility." He didn't reply. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment the only sound was the scrape of chairs and cups in the cafe around us. Then, in a quieter voice, he said, "You don't know what it feels like to be left wondering where you stand. Everything was always between you and Mom. We were just there, orbiting around your choices." Reflective transition. His words cut deeper than the courtroom ever had. Papers argue over property. Families argue over belonging. And in that moment, I realized he wasn't just fighting for assets. He was fighting for a place he wasn't sure he ever had. I told him, "You stood at the center, you just didn't see it." He shook his head, frustrated. "Then why didn't you trust us to carry it? Why lock it all down like we're outsiders?" Because I had seen families unravel over less. Because I had sat at funerals where siblings couldn't look each other in the eye afterward. Because I wanted to spare them that. But saying all of that felt too much like justification, too little like listening. So instead I said, "Maybe I was wrong not to explain sooner, but I wasn't wrong to protect what your mother and I built." Suspenseful transition. He didn't answer right away. His silence wasn't rejection, but it wasn't forgiveness either. It was the kind of silence that meant he was still deciding, still weighing whether he could believe me. When we parted, there was no hug, no handshake, just a nod that carried the weight of unfinished business. I drove home, unsure if that meeting had built a bridge or burned another plank. A few days later, my daughter came by unannounced. She stood at the doorway, her face drawn but softer than it had been in weeks. She asked if she could come in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she once did her homework, her pencils scattered while her mother reminded her to focus. Now she sat with her hands clasped, staring at the wood grain as though it could give her answers. "I talked to my brother," she said. "He told me what you said." "And what do you think?" I asked. She hesitated. I think maybe we were wrong to push it in court. But I also think you were wrong not to tell us what you planned. We didn't need lawyers. We needed you. Conversational transition. Her honesty stung, but it was honest in a way that felt like an opening instead of a wall. And sometimes, that's all a father can ask for, a door left unlocked. I told her I understood, that I should have spoken sooner, explained more, trusted that they could listen even if they disagreed. She nodded, slowly, and for the first time in months, her eyes softened. We talked late into the evening, not about deeds or trusts, but about her life, her children, her worries. It was almost normal, almost like the old rhythm. When she left, she hugged me. It wasn't the strong embrace of certainty, but it wasn't empty either. It was something in between, a truce, fragile but real. Reflective transition. That night, I sat in the quiet and thought about what reconciliation really looks like. It's not a dramatic speech or a courtroom victory. It's smaller. It's a conversation that doesn't collapse into shouting. It's a daughter leaving the house with softer eyes than when she arrived. But with my son, things remained unresolved. He carried his resentment differently, harder to reach, harder to soften. And I knew that if healing was ever to come, it wouldn't be through documents or rulings. It would have to come through the kind of truth that can't be notarized. After my daughter's visit, I thought maybe things were starting to bend back towards something familiar. But when families fracture, one repaired bond doesn't guarantee the rest will follow. My son stayed distant. His silence became heavier than any argument we'd ever had. He wasn't just avoiding me. He was retreating, and every day that passed without a word felt like another door closing. Reflective transition. Silence can be its own kind of betrayal. It doesn't shatter suddenly like anger. It erodes slowly, the way water wears down stone. And I knew if I didn't reach for him, that erosion would leave nothing behind but distance we couldn't repair. So I called him. The phone rang long enough that I nearly gave up, but then he answered with a clipped, "Hello." I asked if he would meet me, no lawyers, no paperwork, just us. He hesitated, then said, "Fine, but this is the last time." Suspenseful transition. The weight in those words pressed hard. Last time. It sounded final, as if he had already decided the shape of our future, and this meeting would only confirm it. We met in the park near his house, the same park where I once pushed him on swings, where he once asked me to teach him how to throw a ball straight. Now he stood stiffly, hands in his pockets, his jaw tight. "You wanted this," he said. "Say what you need to say." I looked at him carefully. He wasn't just angry. He was hurt in a way that pride couldn't hide. And I realized that nothing I said would matter unless I acknowledged that wound first. "I should have trusted you with more than papers," I began. "I should have trusted you with my reasoning, my fears, my hopes. I thought I was protecting you and your sister, but maybe what I really did was build a wall between us." He shook his head. "It's not just the trust. It's everything. You always decided, for years, for all of us. And when we finally had a chance to be included, you locked it down without a word." Conversational transition. His frustration wasn't about documents anymore. It was about a lifetime of feeling smaller in the shadow of decisions he had no part in. And when I heard him say it, I finally understood. This wasn't about houses or money. It was about voice. "I didn't mean to silence you," I said quietly, "but I see that I did, and I can't change how I handled it. What I can do is change how I listen now." He scoffed, looking away. "Listening now doesn't fix the past." "No," I agreed, "but it could shape the future. That's all I have left to offer." For the first time, his eyes flicked toward me, softer but still cautious. He didn't answer, but he didn't walk away either. Suspenseful transition. We walked slowly through the park, saying little. It felt fragile, like stepping on ice you're not sure will hold. Then he broke the quiet. "You know what really hurt?" he asked. "It wasn't losing in court. It was realizing that Mom trusted you with everything and you didn't think we were strong enough to carry any of it. It felt like you didn't believe in us." That struck me harder than I expected, because in truth, I had believed in their potential, but not in their unity. I had seen cracks forming and feared they'd grow wider once inheritance came into play, but I hadn't told them that. I had just acted. I did believe in you, I told him, but I was afraid of what grief can do to people. I didn't want you and your sister torn apart by the weight of decisions neither of you were ready for while mourning your mother. I thought locking things down would protect you from that, but I see now I should have trusted you enough to share those fears. Reflective transition. Saying it out loud made me realize how much of this fight had grown from silence, not action. I had guarded my thoughts, my reasoning, thinking I was sparing them. In reality, I had left them in the dark, and they filled that dark with their own stories of betrayal. He stopped walking. Do you regret it? I thought for a moment. I regret not explaining. I don't regret securing the trust, but I regret losing you in the process. He looked at me, searching for something in my face, weakness, sincerity, or maybe just proof that I meant it. After a long pause, he said, I don't know if I can forgive you yet. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I said. I'm asking for a chance. The air between us shifted slightly, not warm, not settled, but less hostile. He nodded once, then turned toward the parking lot. We'll see, he muttered. Reflective transition. That we'll see wasn't closure, but it wasn't final either. It was a small opening, fragile but present. And sometimes the hardest part of reconciliation is accepting that it doesn't come all at once. It arrives in fragments, an unfinished conversation, a softened tone, a step closer instead of another step back. When I went home that night, I sat in the quiet house and realized something important. This story wasn't about inheritance anymore. It wasn't even about the trust or the deeds. It was about legacy, the kind that isn't written in wills, but in relationships. My wife had always said the true inheritance we leave behind is how our children carry our lessons, not just our assets. For months, I thought the fight was about who would control what we built. But standing in that park with my son, I finally understood. Control was never the issue. Belonging was. And until he felt that he belonged fully, no judgment, no document, no ruling would satisfy him. Suspenseful transition. The road ahead would not be easy. My son's trust was not won back with a single walk or a single admission. It would take time, patience, and maybe more pain. But for the first time since this all began, I believed there was a road at all. As I sat alone in the quiet of the empty church, I realized that dignity isn't about the seat you take or the words others throw at you. It's about standing firm in your truth, even when those around you try to push you aside. Today, the pastor's gesture reminded me that respect can come from unexpected places, and that sometimes quiet endurance earns a louder recognition than any argument ever could. I carried my grief and my pride together, knowing that honoring my wife's memory meant honoring myself as well. This moment wasn't just about being given a seat. It was about reclaiming a voice that had been too long overlooked, proving that resilience can be gentle and still unshakable. And yet, family dynamics never stay simple. One quiet revelation can ripple into a series of truths that challenge everything you thought you knew about those closest to you. If you think a funeral can settle old scores, think again. There's a story I came across not long ago where what seemed like a small gesture led to a frozen moment that revealed decades of hidden tension. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the people you trust most hold the keys to the surprises that shape your life. Curious about how a single key and a frozen reaction can unravel years of hidden family secrets? You'll want to see what unfolded next and how one decision exposed truths no one was ready to face.